A police officer strikes a disabled young girl, an act of cruelty that ignites a firestorm of justice. But what happens when the victim isn't just a bystander? What if she's the spark that ignites a movement? Witness the explosive fight for truth and redemption. Will justice prevail, or will the system crush them all? Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happens next. Tasha Bennett's heart raced as she moved through the bustling market with her father, James. She loved charity events like this one. There were games, food, and people who understood what it was like to live with a disability. It was a rare moment where she didn't feel like the world was watching her, judging her every move. The warmth of the afternoon sun on her face and the sound of laughter in the background should have been enough to make her feel at ease. But something about the way the police officers were looking at her made her uneasy. She could feel their eyes on her back as she wheeled herself through the crowd. James, ever the protective father, noticed it too. He kept glancing back, his instincts sharp as ever. He'd seen too many moments like this before, too many times when someone like him, someone black, was treated like they didn't belong. "Are you okay, Tasha?" James asked, his voice a little more serious than usual. Tasha nodded quickly, trying to brush off the nervous feeling creeping up her spine. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." She tried to shake it off, focusing on the prize she wanted to win at one of the booths. But that unsettling feeling only grew stronger. When they reached the edge of the market near the parking lot, two police officers stepped forward, blocking their path. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice firm, almost demanding. "Can we see your ID?" James stopped in his tracks, immediately sensing something wasn't right. He looked at the officer, trying to assess the situation. "Why do you need to see her ID?" James asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. "She's a disabled child, not a criminal." The officer's eyes narrowed. "It's routine," he replied, but there was something in his tone that made James's chest tighten. Tasha felt her heart race, her breath quickening. She had been in this situation before. The looks, the judgment, the way people assumed she wasn't good enough, wasn't deserving of the space she took up. She could feel her hands tremble on the wheels of her chair. "Let's just get this over with," James muttered, reaching for his wallet. But the officer wasn't done. "We asked her, not you," the other officer said sharply, stepping toward James. "Step aside." Before James could react, the first officer took a step forward and reached down to grab Tasha's shoulder, forcing her to look up at him. Tasha recoiled instinctively, flinching away from the touch. "Don't touch her," James snapped, his voice suddenly full of rage. But it was too late. The officer, who had already been tense, was now seething with frustration. Without warning, he slapped Tasha hard across the face. The sound of the impact rang out across the parking lot, silencing the area. Tasha's head snapped to the side, her eyes wide in shock, her cheeks stinging with the force of the blow. She felt her eyes welling up with tears, her mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The world around her seemed to tilt as she struggled to breathe, the familiar weight of fear pressing down on her chest. James froze for a moment, his anger roaring to life like a wildfire. He grabbed Tasha's wheelchair, his hands shaking as he pulled her protectively toward him. "You son of a—" he began, his voice low and dangerous, but his words were drowned out by a wave of shock and disbelief from the onlookers. The crowd had stopped. The few people milling around the parking lot were staring in horror, unsure of what to do. Some had pulled out their phones, capturing the moment in real time. Tasha's cheek burned with the pain of the slap, but the real sting was the fear that she couldn't shake off, the fear that had lived inside her for so long. She looked up at her father, eyes wide with confusion and terror. He was the one person who had always protected her, and now he was just as helpless as she was. "Why? Why did he do that?" Tasha whispered, barely able to hold back her tears. James's hands balled into fists, his face flushed with rage. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the anger was too much to contain. "It's okay, baby," he said, his voice cracking, though his hands were still trembling. "I'll handle this." Before he could say anything more, a figure pushed through the crowd, stepping in front of the officers. It was Lena Jefferson, a retired judge with a reputation for taking down corrupt officials. Her presence commanded attention, and without missing a beat, she stared at the officers, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "You've done enough," Lena said coolly, her voice dripping with authority. "Now step aside before things get worse for you." The officers hesitated, but their faces were full of contempt. The tension in the air was palpable. Lena's reputation had already put a target on her back, and she knew this moment could ignite something much bigger than a mere altercation. James looked at her, unsure but grateful. Are you? I'm here to make sure this doesn't escalate, Lena interrupted. We need to talk. James sat silently in his car, staring at the flashing lights of the police vehicle still parked in the lot. Tasha, beside him, was trying to hold back tears, her cheeks still swollen from the slap. The anger inside James simmered beneath the surface. But now, as the weight of the situation settled in, it was slowly being replaced by something much colder: determination. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let Tasha go through this and let those men walk away unscathed. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about a bad cop. This was about a system that was broken and needed to be fixed. And that system, he feared, was much bigger than he had imagined. Lena Jefferson had promised him she'd help. She had been a judge for years, had seen the insides of the courtrooms, the politics that controlled them, and she knew just how corrupt the police force in Chicago could be. James hadn't fully understood her commitment until now. He had trusted her, but now, as they sat in the parking lot, the weight of what they were about to face hit him with full force. They were going up against more than just Officer Harris. They were about to take on the entire system. How much longer? Tasha's voice broke the silence, pulling James from his thoughts. He turned to her, his face softening. Just a little longer, baby, I promise. We're going to make sure this never happens again. Tasha gave him a small nod, but James could see the fear in her eyes. She had always been the strong one, the brave one, but now she was scared. And he couldn't blame her. His phone buzzed, cutting through the silence of the car. It was a text from Lena. We need to talk. Meet me at my office. I've found something. James's heart skipped a beat. Something. What had she found? He didn't want to think about it, but the question gnawed at him. He started the car, the engine humming to life as they pulled away from the parking lot. The journey to Lena's office was short, but it felt longer than it really was. Every stoplight, every turn seemed to stretch the time, making him feel like he was walking into an uncertain future. Lena's office was in a high-rise building downtown, far from the familiar streets of South Side. It was sleek, modern, too clean for a woman who had spent so much of her life fighting the system. She had the kind of office that made you feel like you were about to get an earful of truth, whether you were ready for it or not. James! Lena greeted him as soon as he stepped through the door, her face serious. I'm glad you came. Of course, he said, his voice tight. What's going on? What have you found? Lena sat down behind her desk, motioning for him to take a seat. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she pressed her fingers together, staring at them as if they held the answers she was about to give. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of determination and something darker, something that told James this wasn't going to be easy. I've been digging into Harris, Lena began, her voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency, and I've found something that could blow this whole thing wide open. James's stomach tightened. He leaned forward, bracing himself. You need to understand, Lena continued. This isn't just about him. Harris is a symptom of a much bigger issue. His actions, his history of abuse, they've been protected for years by people at the top, and not just police officers. There's corruption in the city government, and it's been covering for him, for others like him. James felt like the ground was pulled out from beneath him. He had suspected as much, but hearing Lena say it aloud made it real. This was no longer just a fight for his daughter. This was a battle against a system that had been poisoning the very foundation of their city. Lena slid a manila folder across the desk to James. I've been working with some people who have access to the records. Harris's father. She stopped, letting the name hang in the air. He's a key figure in the city council. He's been pulling strings to keep his son protected for years. James blinked, feeling the weight of the revelation settle in. Harris's father was a city councilman? The thought made his blood run cold. He knew what this meant. Harris wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of a network of power that would stop at nothing to protect its own. Lena went on. I found evidence. Harris's files were hidden, covered up, erased. His violent actions were swept under the rug. The city paid people to keep things quiet, to ensure nothing came of it. Harris wasn't just protected by his badge, he was protected by the people who run this city. James's mind raced. This wasn't just a local issue. This was a citywide problem, one that stretched far beyond his personal grievances with the police. His anger flared again, but this time it was mixed with something darker, something that had been brewing ever since the slap. He had never felt so small, so helpless. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter now, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged, silenced, or ignored by a corrupt system. "Do you have proof?" James asked, his voice rough with emotion. Lena nodded, pulling out a few printed pages from the folder. "I do. This isn't everything, but it's a start. We can take it to the press, to the courts, but we'll have to be careful. There's a lot more at stake now. People will try to bury this again." James looked down at the papers. He didn't need to read all of it to understand what Lena was saying. They were up against more than just Harris. They were up against the very people who were supposed to protect them. And that knowledge, that weight, made everything feel even more urgent, more real. "Then let's make sure they can't bury it," James said, his voice cold with resolve. "Let's make sure the world sees what they've been hiding." Lena's eyes softened. "We'll do this right. We'll take it slow, build our case carefully, but we can't do it alone." James nodded. He had known that, but hearing it from Lena made it feel more like a commitment, one that would change everything. He stood, Tasha's image flashing in his mind. The way she looked up at him after the slap, vulnerable but also filled with a strength he hadn't fully seen until now. This fight was no longer just about justice. It was about protecting the people he loved. "You're right," he said, feeling the fire build inside him. "We'll take them down, and we'll do it together." James couldn't sleep. His mind raced with the weight of everything that had been uncovered in the past few days. Lena's revelation about Harris's father, the city councilman, made everything feel infinitely more complicated. He had thought he was just fighting for justice, for his daughter, for the countless people who had been victimized by the system. But now it felt like they were up against an enemy far bigger than they could ever have imagined. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Tasha was asleep, but James couldn't find rest. He kept replaying the image of her, her face swollen from the slap, her eyes filled with a kind of fear that no father ever wants to see in his child. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "James?" Lena's voice came through the wood, steady and firm as always. "We need to talk." He opened the door to find Lena standing there, her face serious. There was a brief moment of silence as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the tension that hung in the air. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. "What now?" Lena hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one was watching. "James, this is bigger than we thought. Harris might not be the only one we have to worry about." James frowned. "What are you talking about?" Lena took a deep breath. "The police department's been under scrutiny for a while, but it's not just about abuse. It's about the network of people who protect it. There are others involved, and not just officers. People who have power, people who can make sure nothing comes of this." James clenched his fists. "Who?" His voice cracked. "Who's protecting him? Who else?" Lena sat down, her posture stiff, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't have all the details, but it goes deep. We've been poking around for too long. You've seen the threats, you've felt the heat. They're escalating things now. And it's not just about Harris anymore. They're coming for us." James stared at her, his mind spinning. "What do you mean, coming for us?" Lena met his gaze with cold, hard eyes. "They'll go after anyone who's trying to expose this. You and Tasha included. You need to be prepared. This is bigger than a few bad cops." James sat in stunned silence as Lena's words sank in. His chest tightened, his hands clenching into fists. He knew that what he was doing wasn't just about righting one wrong. It was about taking down an entire system. And that system, it seemed, would stop at nothing to protect itself. Later that night, as the clock ticked into the early hours, the phone rang. James was still sitting in his living room, staring at the darkened walls. The sound of the phone ringing felt like a shot in the quiet. He picked it up without looking at the screen. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and then a low, gravelly voice spoke. "James Bennett, right?" His heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the voice. "Who is this?" the voice continued, unfazed. "You don't know me, but I know you. I've been watching you, watching everything you've been doing. All this fuss over Harris. You don't realize what you're up against. You think you're fighting a corrupt cop. Nah, this is much bigger than that." James's stomach twisted. He felt the blood rush to his head. "Who is this? What do you want?" The voice laughed darkly. "What I want, Bennett, is for you to stay in your lane. Stop digging, because the people you're about to anger, you don't want to know them. Your little fight with Harris, that's nothing compared to the people who are protecting him. You're treading dangerous waters. James felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. What's your point? You'll see soon enough. The voice hung up, leaving James with a knot of dread in his stomach. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. The threats were becoming real. James found his car keyed one morning, a note left on his windshield. Stop or else. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every corner he turned, every action he took was under scrutiny. Tasha grew more withdrawn, and the quiet terror in her eyes deepened. James couldn't protect her from this, no matter how hard he tried. He wanted to shield her, to make the world a safer place for her, but that wasn't possible. Not now. Things took another turn when Lena called again. This time there was a sense of urgency in her voice. We've got a bigger problem. We need to meet. James was already halfway out the door when he heard the muffled sounds of sirens in the distance. His heart skipped. Something wasn't right. When he arrived at Lena's office, she looked even more unsettled than before. She motioned for him to sit, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk, her face pale. What is it? James asked, his voice thick with worry. Lena exhaled slowly. I've been digging deeper into the case, and it turns out Harris wasn't just protected by his father. There's more. People on the inside of the police force, commanders, officers, all involved in sweeping things under the rug, and they've been looking for ways to silence us. They've already made moves behind the scenes. James clenched his fists. What kind of moves? James. Lena trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. They've already gotten to Montgomery. He's gone, disappeared. I tried calling him, but no one knows where he is. They've silenced him. The room felt like it was closing in. Montgomery, his ally, the one person he thought they could trust, was gone. They've come for him, Lena continued, her tone hardening. And now they're coming for you, for Tasha, for anyone who dares to expose them. James stood, the weight of it all crashing down on him. His family was in danger, but so were the people who had dared to help him. This wasn't just about Harris anymore. This was about a system that would stop at nothing to protect its own. He had no choice but to keep going. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. James sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the stack of files Lena had handed him. Each page was filled with details, names, dates, and hidden connections. The depth of corruption he was facing felt like an endless maze. And with every file he flipped through, he sank deeper into it. Lena had warned him, but he hadn't fully understood the scope of what they were up against. Harris's involvement was just the surface. Below it was a network that spread far beyond the police department, into the highest echelons of city politics and law enforcement. A web of people who would stop at nothing to protect themselves and keep the truth buried. James ran his fingers over the files, his mind racing. How had it all come to this? How had a simple act of injustice turned into a battle against an entire system? His anger flared, but underneath it, there was a gnawing feeling of fear that they might never make it out alive if they kept pushing. Lena, he started, his voice barely a whisper. This goes all the way up, doesn't it? Lena nodded slowly, her expression tight. It's bigger than I thought. Harris is just the tip of the iceberg. There are people within the system who've been protecting him for years. This isn't just about stopping one corrupt cop. This is about taking down a whole network, a machine that's been working against us for far too long. James let out a deep breath, his chest tight. He had known things weren't as simple as they seemed, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. He thought of Tasha, of everything she'd been through, and everything he'd promised her. He couldn't back down now. He wouldn't. But what if it cost them everything? What if exposing the truth led them to places they weren't ready for? Lena leaned forward, her voice urgent. We have to move fast. They're closing in on us, James. If we don't act now, we might not get another chance. They've already made it clear they want us to stop. James looked down at the papers in his hands. There were names he didn't recognize, phone numbers, addresses, all linked to various officers, city officials, and businessmen. His fingers hovered over the next page, the weight of it all starting to press on him. Who are these people? He asked, his voice strained. And why hasn't anyone spoken out about this before? Lena's face darkened. Because no one dares. They've created an environment where silence is the only option. If you speak up, you disappear. Your career, your life. It's all gone in the blink of an eye. I've seen it happen. I've seen people pay the price for doing the right thing. It's not just the cops. It's the system that protects them. The room felt smaller suddenly, suffocating. James clenched his jaw, trying to hold his composure. He had to stay focused. He had to be strong, for Tasha, for everyone who had been wronged. "I'm not backing down," James said firmly, his voice a low growl. "I'm not going to let them get away with this. But I need to know everything. I need to know who's behind this." Lena's eyes flickered with something like regret, but she didn't hesitate. "I'll tell you what I know, James. But you have to understand, you're going up against real power. People who will do whatever it takes to keep their secrets safe. People who have killed to protect themselves." A chill ran through James at the thought, but his resolve hardened. He couldn't back down now. They'd taken the first swing. It was time to fight back. Later that night, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The names Lena had given him were haunting him. He kept turning them over in his mind, trying to piece together the connections, the motives. They were all tied to something bigger, something dangerous. He went to bed late, but sleep didn't come. His mind kept racing through the names, the dates, the files. One name stood out among the rest: Councilman David Watts, the man who had protected Harris, who had used his influence to keep the officer above reproach. Watts was connected to some of the city's most powerful people: businessmen, politicians, law enforcement officials. And then there was Detective Rachel Dawson, a name that appeared repeatedly in the files. She was involved in several shady cases that had mysteriously been swept under the rug. James couldn't help but wonder if she had been a part of the cover-up, if she had been the one pulling strings behind the scenes. His phone buzzed, breaking him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. "Lena. We need to talk," the message read. "Meet me tomorrow." The next day, James met Lena at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. He sat down across from her, his mind still reeling from the discoveries of the night before. Lena looked even more on edge than usual. Her eyes darted around, checking the room. She leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "They know we're onto them." James felt his heart race. "What do you mean?" "They've been watching me, watching you. They know we're digging, and they're coming for us. It's just a matter of time." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. James's throat tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected things to get this dangerous, this quickly. Lena continued, her voice low but urgent. "There's more I need to tell you, things I couldn't say before. People who are higher up in this than I ever realized. People who will stop at nothing to keep their control." James felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Who?" Lena hesitated. "The mayor, his office, they're all connected, and they've been covering up crimes for years." James's world seemed to tilt. The mayor? The same man who had publicly promised change, who had talked about fighting corruption? He was part of it? His hands trembled as he thought about the web of lies and corruption they were up against. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. Lena's eyes softened with sympathy. "Now we go public. We get the truth out. No more playing it safe. We expose them all." James nodded, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. They had no choice now. It was all or nothing. The first real blow came swiftly. James wasn't prepared for it. It was a Saturday morning, and the day had started like any other. Quiet, routine. Tasha was still asleep in her room, the house peaceful for the moment. James sat at the kitchen table, going over the notes Lena had left him the night before. Names, contacts, evidence. His thoughts were focused, but the constant tension gnawed at him. Every time the phone buzzed, his stomach tightened. He didn't hear the car pull up outside, but he saw the shadow cross the window. Then came the knock. James set down the pen, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't the usual knock. It was sharp, insistent. Something was off. His mind raced, immediately jumping to the worst conclusion. The knock came again, louder. He stood up, feeling the weight of his own heartbeat in his chest. He crossed the living room to the front door, his hand on the doorknob. When he opened it, he froze. Standing on the other side was a man in a suit, an unfamiliar face. Behind him were two uniformed officers standing silently, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, his voice clipped and formal. "We need to speak with you." James's gut twisted. He knew this wasn't a friendly visit. "What is this about?" The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the officers, then back at James. "It's about your involvement in the Harris case," he said. "We need you to come with us." "Is this a joke?" James's voice grew cold, his jaw tightening. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this is about." The man's expression darkened, and he took a step forward. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Bennett." The officers flanked him, and James felt a sudden shift in the air, a suffocating pressure as if the walls were closing in around him. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. They weren't here to talk. His heart hammered in his chest. They were coming for him. Before he could say another word, the officer on his right reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Sir, we're going to have to take you in for questioning." James recoiled. His hands instinctively went up, trying to ward them off. "No, I'm not going anywhere with you." His voice was filled with defiance, but there was an undercurrent of fear he couldn't suppress. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just intimidation. They were making their move. The officer advanced again, but before he could make contact, James snapped. "Get your hands off me!" he shouted, his chest heaving with rage. But the officer was too quick. He grabbed James's arm, twisting it behind his back. In that moment, James knew this was real. They weren't just trying to intimidate him. This was retaliation, punishment for standing up against the system, for daring to fight back. Tasha's voice broke through the chaos. "Dad," she screamed from the hallway. James's head snapped toward her, his heart sinking. He saw her standing there, frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Tasha didn't move, her small frame standing stock still, as if she were rooted to the ground. "Dad, what's happening?" Her voice cracked, her breath uneven. James's mind raced. He couldn't let them do this. Not in front of Tasha. Not now. "Go back to your room, Tasha," he said urgently, trying to sound calm, but his voice shook with the weight of the situation. "Please go to your room." But she didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked on him, her expression torn between fear and confusion. The officer's grip on his arm tightened, and James turned back to face him. "You don't have any right to do this," he spat, his voice growing more desperate. "I haven't done anything wrong." The man in the suit stepped forward again, his tone unwavering. "You're involved in something bigger than you realize, Mr. Bennett. We have enough evidence to bring you in. You should be thanking us. We're not charging you right now." James's blood ran cold. He was trapped. There was no escaping this now. He was being silenced. "Let me go!" he roared, but the officer's hold was unyielding. Tasha stepped forward then, her eyes wide with panic. "No, don't touch him," she shouted. "He didn't do anything wrong." The words came from her with such intensity, James could feel the heat of her desperation. His daughter, his sweet, strong Tasha, was standing up to them, trying to protect him, and it nearly shattered him. She wasn't supposed to be in this position. She wasn't supposed to have to fight for him. The officer glanced at the man in the suit. He nodded subtly, then turned back to James. "You're making this difficult, Mr. Bennett, but if you want to play it this way, we can make it worse." James's mind screamed for him to fight back. He felt the anger rising in him, but he also knew the consequences. This wasn't just a matter of pride anymore. This was about his family, about keeping them safe. "Take him," the man said coldly, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. The officers moved quickly, forcing James into the back of their car. Tasha's eyes followed him the whole way, her face full of hurt and confusion. She was too young to understand what was happening, but James could see it in her eyes. The fear, the confusion, it was all there. The same fear that had filled his own heart when he'd first seen the injustices in the world. As the door slammed shut behind him, James locked eyes with her one last time. He couldn't let her see him broken. He couldn't let them win. The door slammed shut behind him, the weight of the officer's grip still lingering on his arm. James sat in the back of the police car, his mind racing. The hard plastic of the seat pressed into his back as the vehicle sped through the streets. Tasha's face, filled with terror and confusion, was still burned into his mind. How did it come to this? The officers remained silent, their cold eyes fixed on the road ahead. But James's thoughts were a whirlwind. His mind kept replaying the moments leading up to his arrest, the knock on the door, the sudden escalation, and then the realization that he was trapped. He had always known there were forces at play, but this felt like something bigger than he could fight alone. His phone, still in his pocket, buzzed. He couldn't help but reach for it, desperate for any form of communication, any connection to the outside world. It was a message from Lena. "James, listen to me. You're in danger. There's someone inside the department who's on your side. They'll help you. Trust me." His heart skipped a beat. A part of him wanted to dismiss it, but deep down, he knew Lena wouldn't send him on a wild goose chase. Who could she possibly be talking about? The car jolted to a stop, pulling him out of his thoughts. The officers stepped out and one of them motioned for James to follow. He was led into the precinct's holding area, cold, sterile, and eerily silent. It smelled of bleach and regret. As the door to the holding cell clanged shut behind him, James's stomach churned. He was now officially part of the system he had been fighting against. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. And the walls were closing in. But as he sat on the cold metal bench, he heard something strange. Voices. Low murmurs outside the cell, too quiet to make out. One voice stood out above the rest, a voice he knew. "Let him go," the voice said, firm, urgent. "This is a mistake." James's heart skipped, his eyes snapping toward the door. He hadn't seen anyone else since his arrest. The last person he expected to hear was Detective Alan Montgomery. He'd thought Montgomery was just another part of the system, the same as everyone else. A part of him had even doubted the man when he had offered to help. But now, hearing his voice, the tension in James's chest began to ease, just slightly. "Detective?" The officer outside the cell questioned, sounding confused. "What are you doing here?" "I said let him go," Montgomery repeated, more forceful this time. "You know this is wrong." James's pulse quickened. Could this be true? Was Montgomery really on his side? He waited, the seconds feeling like hours. Finally, the sound of keys rattling in the door. The door swung open, and there stood Montgomery, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. "Get up," Montgomery said, his voice low and urgent. "We don't have much time." James hesitated, his mind still reeling from the shock of being freed, but he didn't question it. He stood up, his legs unsteady, but his resolve strengthening. Montgomery didn't wait. He grabbed James by the arm and led him down the hallway, past other officers who seemed oblivious to their movements. "Where are we going?" James whispered, the words a breathless rush. "To safety," Montgomery replied, his voice calm despite the chaos of the situation. "I didn't want it to come to this, but you forced my hand. They know we're onto them, James. They'll be coming for you soon. We need to move fast." James's thoughts raced. "Why are you helping me? Why now?" Montgomery glanced at him, his jaw tightening. "Because I'm done letting them walk all over people like you. I've been complicit for too long. I've seen what's been happening. I've ignored it, but not anymore." They turned a corner and stopped in front of a door that led to a small office. Montgomery knocked twice, then opened it without waiting for a response. Inside was another figure, a woman, older, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She stood up as they entered, her gaze immediately locking onto James. "He's with us," Montgomery said quickly, his voice urgent. "We need to move him now." The woman didn't ask questions, but her expression softened when she saw James. "You're lucky we got here when we did," she said, her voice tight. "They were planning to charge you with obstruction and resisting arrest. That would have been just the start." James looked from one to the other, still trying to process the fact that he had an ally, someone on the inside. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The woman smiled grimly. "I'm Rachel Dawson. You've heard my name before. I've been watching Harris for a long time. I've seen everything he's done, but I wasn't in a position to do anything about it until now. Now that I'm no longer tied down by the system, I can help, and I will." The words hit James like a shockwave. Detective Rachel Dawson, the same person he had once suspected might be involved in the cover-up, was now standing before him offering help. "I can't do this alone," Dawson continued. "You've got the right people behind you, James, but we need to act fast. They're going to make an example of you if you don't get out of here soon." Montgomery stepped forward, handing James a bag. "This is everything you need. IDs, cash, a few contacts. You won't be able to stay here much longer." James's mind was spinning. He had trusted the wrong people, but now he was faced with an unexpected ally who was offering him a lifeline. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of everything was almost too much to bear. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all the people who had been silenced. "Don't thank me yet," Dawson replied. "We've only just begun." The news spread like wildfire. James couldn't ignore the flashes on his phone screen, alerts, texts, social media posts. The video of Tasha being slapped by Officer Harris had gone viral, and it wasn't just his family's fight anymore. People across the city were angry. People were rallying. It started small. Just a few people gathered at a local park with signs demanding justice. But it grew quickly. Word spread about Tasha, about the injustice, and suddenly, faces he didn't recognize were showing up to support their cause. People from all walks of life were coming together, united by the same outrage. James watched from a distance, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified. The momentum was real now. It was bigger than him, bigger than his family's fight. It had become a movement, and with it came both hope and fear. He and Lena sat in the back of a small cafe, talking strategy. Lena had become his most trusted ally, guiding him through the maze of legalities and media attention. But even she could sense the pressure building. They both knew the risks of the movement escalating, what it meant for them, for Tasha. "They're going to try to shut us down," Lena said, her voice low, laced with urgency. "The system won't let this go on for long. We need to act fast." James nodded, but there was something else in his eyes, something burning behind them. The rage, the frustration, all of it had built up in him over the past few days. He couldn't just sit back and let it happen anymore. "I'm not backing down," James said firmly, his fists clenched. "We fight, Lena. We fight back." The protests grew in size over the next few days. People were chanting, holding signs, demanding change. The city streets, once bustling with the routine hum of everyday life, had transformed. Now, there were crowds marching, voices raised in defiance, calling for accountability, justice for Tasha, justice for all the victims of police brutality. The police tried to control it at first, blocking streets, arresting a few protesters, but the movement only swelled. The people had had enough, and it wasn't just about Tasha anymore. It was about every individual who had ever been subjected to the same cruelty. James stood at the front of one of the rallies, watching as the crowd gathered around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with the same anger, the same desire for change. It was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. Tasha stood by his side, her presence a reminder of everything they were fighting for. She was stronger now. The fear in her eyes had started to fade, replaced by something else, resolve. Her voice, shaky at first, had grown louder, more confident. She was speaking out now, too. She grabbed the mic, her voice crackling at first, then growing steadier with each word. "I never thought I'd be here, standing in front of you all, fighting for justice. But I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for everyone who's been treated this way. I'm fighting for my family, and I'm fighting for the future." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers deafening. For a moment, James felt his heart lift, a surge of pride that his daughter, who had once been so afraid, was now standing with so many others who believed in her. But that night, as James lay in bed, his phone buzzed again. This time the message wasn't a rally cry or a show of support. It was a warning. "You've been warned, Bennett. Stop now or there will be consequences." He stared at the message, the words sinking deep into his chest. He'd known this was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it real. The powers that be weren't just watching. They were preparing to strike back. Tasha, who had been sitting quietly beside him, looked over his shoulder. "What is it, Dad?" James hesitated, then put the phone down, his hand trembling slightly. He had always kept things from her before, but not now, not when things were escalating. "It's just a warning," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They want us to back off, but we're not going to." Tasha nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "We can't stop now, can we?" "No," James said firmly, his voice full of conviction. "We're in this together, and we're going to see it through." The next few days were filled with tension. The protests continued, but so did the attempts to silence them. The police began using more forceful tactics, trying to break up the gatherings with tear gas, rubber bullets, and arrests. The media coverage was mixed. Some outlets painted the protests as violent, while others framed them as a much-needed call for change. James felt like a target now. Every move he made, every word he spoke, felt like it was being scrutinized. He and Lena met privately, devising a plan to protect Tasha, to keep her safe while also continuing to push the movement forward. The last thing he wanted was for her to get caught up in the violence. But even as they made their plans, the movement was gaining strength. More and more people were coming out to support them, putting their own lives at risk for a cause that was no longer just about Tasha's assault. It was about systemic change. It was about standing up against a system that had failed too many for too long. James watched it all unfold, his heart heavy with the weight of it. The danger, the stakes, they were higher now, but he couldn't back down. Not now, not when the people who needed to hear this message were finally listening. As the days passed, the protests only grew louder. The city was on edge, and so were James and Tasha. The world had seen their fight, had heard their voices, but the true battle had only just begun. James stood tall, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just about one moment. It was about the future. and he would fight for it, no matter the cost. James's stomach churned as he stared at the text message on his phone screen. The words burned into his mind, unrelenting and cold. "You've been warned, Bennett. Back off, or there will be consequences. Don't think we don't have eyes on you." He dropped the phone onto the table, his hands trembling. The weight of the threat settled heavily in his chest, the chill of it spreading through his veins. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, an ultimatum. They were trying to intimidate him into silence, but James wasn't backing down. Not now, not after everything they'd done. "Dad!" Tasha's voice called from the doorway, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. James looked up, his expression hard, the cold fire of determination lighting his eyes. "Yeah, baby?" Tasha stepped inside, her brow furrowed with worry. "Who was that?" James paused for a moment, his mind racing. He couldn't let her see the fear creeping into his own heart. He had to stay strong for her. "Just someone trying to scare us," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tasha nodded, but James could see the doubt in her eyes. She knew him too well. "You're not scared, are you, Dad?" Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question stung, but James refused to let her see the doubt. He stood up, walking over to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We're not going anywhere, Tasha. This fight isn't over." But as he said the words, something gnawed at him. The longer they fought, the more dangerous it became, and the more secrets seemed to rise to the surface. It wasn't long before the next blow hit. The next day, Lena called him with urgent news. She was at a local cafe, her voice strained when James picked up the phone. "James, you need to get over here. Now. It's bad." James's stomach dropped. "What is it, Lena?" "I can't explain over the phone. Just, please, get here." The line went dead, and James didn't waste any time. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, his thoughts swirling with fear and uncertainty. What now? What could they possibly be up against next? When he arrived, Lena was already waiting, pacing anxiously outside the cafe. Her face was pale, the urgency in her step telling him everything he needed to know. Something had gone wrong. "Lena," James said, his voice tight. "What's going on?" Lena stopped pacing, her hands trembling as she handed him a folder. "I've got something you need to see." James took it from her without saying a word, ripping it open. Inside were documents, files that should have never been in his hands. As he flipped through them, his blood ran cold. The documents revealed the depth of the conspiracy: names, dates, payments, and signatures. People James had trusted, people he'd worked with, were all linked to the cover-up. It wasn't just the police department. It wasn't just Harris and his father. It was a network of corruption that spread throughout the city's political and law enforcement systems. James's hand shook as he read the name at the top of the page, Lena Jefferson. "What the hell is this?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if the words might cut him. Lena looked away, a shadow crossing her face. "I didn't want you to find out this way, but you need to know. I've been keeping things from you, James. Things I didn't know how to tell you. Things I should have told you sooner." James stood frozen, the weight of the revelation hitting him harder than any blow ever could. Lena, the one person he thought he could trust, the one person who had stood by him through it all, was a part of this. "Lena, what is this? What have you been involved in?" His voice cracked as the betrayal took root in his chest. She closed her eyes, her face contorting with guilt. "I've been trying to protect you, protect your family. But the truth is, I've been a part of this system for longer than I care to admit. I didn't want to believe it, but I've seen it firsthand. I've seen the deals, the backroom agreements, the corruption. But when Harris got involved, when things started getting real, I couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. I couldn't stay silent." James felt like the world was spinning out of control. The people he had counted on, Lena, the system he had trusted to bring justice, had all been lies. "So you've been part of this the whole time, helping them cover it up?" he spat, his words filled with disbelief and anger. Lena nodded slowly, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I didn't want to be. I thought I could change things from the inside, but the deeper I got, the more I realized how much power they had, how far-reaching this corruption goes. I made deals to protect you, James, to keep you safe, but now it's too far. They'll come for you. They'll come for us all." James felt like he had been hit by a freight train. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, the rush of blood making his head spin. He couldn't breathe. Lena, the person who had stood beside him in this fight, the person he had trusted with his daughter's future, had been part of the system he had been fighting against. She had helped them. The room felt suffocating. James took a step back, his mind reeling. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but nothing came out. He just stood there, staring at Lena, seeing her in a new light. His ally, his confidant, had betrayed him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered, her voice full of regret. "I never meant for it to get this far. But now we have no choice. We have to expose them. All of them. If we don't, they'll come for you next. And they'll take everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. Betrayal. Revelation. The entire foundation of their fight had shifted. There was no going back now. "Who else is involved?" James asked, his voice low and steady, the anger slowly turning into cold resolve. Lena hesitated, but then her eyes hardened. "Everyone. They have their fingers in everything. If you think Harris was the worst of it, James, you're wrong." And with that, the truth of their fight became even clearer. The battle was bigger than they had ever imagined. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as James walked in, his heart pounding in his chest. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. The air seemed thick with tension as people shifted in their seats, eyes glued to the front of the room, to the defense table, to the small podium where the judge would preside. James stood at the back for a moment, taking in the sight. This was it, the moment he had fought for, and yet it felt like it could all slip away in an instant. His eyes found Tasha sitting in the front row, her back straight, her face set in a mask of determination. James's chest tightened. She had been through so much already, but here she was, brave as ever, willing to stand up for what was right. He couldn't let this fail. He couldn't let them take this from her, from all of them. Lena was beside him, her presence a steadying force as they both made their way to their seats. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. This wasn't just about one cop. This wasn't just about one injustice. This was about something far greater, something that would change their city, their lives, forever. The doors at the front of the courtroom opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the walls. The room fell silent. Harris stepped in, flanked by his lawyers, his posture rigid. He didn't look at James. He didn't look at Tasha. His eyes were cold, unreadable, but James could feel the weight of them on him. It was like Harris was trying to intimidate them even without saying a word. James clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. He had been looking forward to this moment, the chance to make them see the truth, the chance to finally get justice for Tasha. But now that it was here, now that it was real, the fear set in. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The public was watching. The world was watching. The judge entered and the room became even quieter. Judge Collins was known for being tough, no nonsense, a stickler for rules, and always impartial. But James had seen how the system worked. He knew how easy it was to manipulate the courts, to skew things in favor of the powerful. He had to believe in this judge. He had to believe this trial could be different. "Court is in session," Judge Collins said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We will begin with opening statements. Prosecutor, you may proceed." The prosecutor, a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression, stood and adjusted his glasses. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because a young girl, Tasha Bennett, was assaulted by a police officer, a man who swore to protect and serve. Officer Harris struck this child, this innocent child, with no provocation, no justification. And now, we are here to seek justice for her." Tasha's eyes flickered to James, and he reached out, giving her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. She nodded once, her chin held high. James couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Tasha wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter. The prosecutor continued, his voice unwavering. "We will prove that Officer Harris violated the law, that he abused his position of power, and that he deserves to be held accountable. No one, no matter their profession, no matter their badge, is above the law. We will show you the truth, and we will prove that this officer is guilty of the crime he committed." James felt the words settle in his stomach like a weight. This wasn't just about the slap. It wasn't just about one officer. This was about exposing a system that allowed this kind of violence to happen, again and again, without consequence. Harris was just one piece of the puzzle, but he was the piece that could bring it all down. Harris's lawyer, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, stood up next. His gaze swept across the room before he began speaking, his voice smooth and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney began, You have heard the accusations, but the truth, the real truth, is much more complicated. My client, Officer Harris, did not act out of malice. He acted out of concern for the safety of himself and his fellow officers. We will show that the actions of Mr. Bennett and his daughter led to a series of events that caused Officer Harris to make a split-second decision that any officer in his position would have made. This is not about racism. This is not about abuse of power. This is about fear, and it is about self-defense. James felt his jaw tighten. He could already tell how this was going to go. The defense was going to spin it, turn the tables, paint them as the aggressors, as the ones who had pushed Harris into action. They would make it sound like it was Tasha's fault, like she had somehow provoked the officer. James glanced at Tasha. She had heard it all before. The defense would twist the story, distort the truth. But she couldn't let them get away with it. They couldn't let the world think they were the ones to blame. Tasha stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and James knew instantly what she was going to do. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had fought for. She spoke loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "They're lying," Tasha said, her eyes focused on Harris. "He slapped me. I didn't do anything to him. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for the violence. I didn't ask to be afraid." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "And I'm not the only one. There are so many people out there who live in fear of the police, who live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect us. But we don't have to be afraid anymore. Not if we stand up. Not if we tell the truth." The room fell silent. Even Harris seemed taken aback by her words. The prosecutor gave Tasha a small nod, but it was the defense attorney who spoke next, his voice laced with venom. "Your Honor," he said, "this is nothing more than a dramatic display designed to manipulate the jury. The facts of the case are clear. My client was merely reacting to a threat. Tasha Bennett's story does not change the fact that she and her father were the ones who escalated the situation." James clenched his fists. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. The trial had just begun, and already the fight was becoming more personal. Tasha's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, the world outside the courtroom seemed to fade away. He saw the determination in her gaze, the courage she had found despite everything. And in that moment, James knew, no matter what happened in the coming days, they couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was finally in the light. The trial had begun, but their fight was far from over. The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet. Every eye in the room was trained on Tasha as she took the stand, her hands gripping the edges of the podium, her fingers pale against the cold metal. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and yet she stood taller than she ever had before. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice that could no longer be silenced. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't afford to show fear now. Not when so much was on the line. Not when the truth was finally within reach. She glanced briefly at her father sitting at the defense table. James's face was a mask of resolve, his eyes unwavering. He was here for her, as he always had been, but she could see the tightness in his jaw. She could see how hard this was for him, how much he wished to be able to protect her from everything that had happened. But there was no protection left. There was only the truth. Tasha took a deep breath and spoke. "My name is Tasha Bennett. I am here because I was slapped by Officer Harris. I was hurt. I was humiliated. But more than anything, I was scared." Her voice shook, but she held her ground. She had to. "I'm here because what happened to me that day isn't just about me," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of the jurors. "It's about everyone who's been treated like this, everyone who's been hurt by the people who are supposed to protect us. I'm not the only one, and I won't be the last if things don't change." Her words hung in the air like a spark waiting to catch fire. The prosecutor stood, his face cold and unyielding. But Tasha didn't back down. She wasn't afraid of the system anymore. Not after everything they had been through. Not after seeing the cracks in the foundation. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice low and calculated. "Tasha, you claim that Officer Harris assaulted you, but there's no clear evidence that he acted with malicious intent. You were—" "I wasn't threatening him," Tasha cut in sharply, her voice ringing out with unshakable conviction. "I wasn't resisting. I wasn't even doing anything. He slapped me for no reason. He hurt me because I was in a wheelchair, because I look different, because I'm not like him." Her words hit like a bomb, sending a ripple through the room. James's heart clenched as he watched her, his chest tight with the overwhelming need to protect her. But this was her fight now. She was the one speaking the truth, standing in front of everyone, in front of the very people who had allowed this to happen. And he couldn't shield her from this anymore. All he could do was stand beside her. Tasha took another breath, her eyes now fixed firmly on the defense table. She could feel the weight of Harris's eyes on her, the contempt behind them, but she didn't flinch. "You have to understand," she continued, her voice steadying with each word. "This is not about me. This is about the people who can't speak up, the people who are too scared, too ashamed to say anything. This is about the fact that people like me, people who look like me, are treated like we're not worth protecting." She let the words sink in, her gaze never wavering. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. The room felt charged, the energy palpable as everyone waited for the next move. The defense attorney stood slowly, adjusting his tie, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat and faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard today is a powerful story, but it is one told from only one perspective. My client, Officer Harris, has his own version of events. He wasn't acting out of malice. He was simply doing his job, responding to a potentially volatile situation." The defense attorney glanced at the jury, a sly smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yes, there was a slap. Yes, there was contact. But it was not an act of violence. It was a momentary lapse, a reaction to the tension in the air. My client acted out of fear for his safety and for the safety of his fellow officers. He had no choice. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a slap all over again, and this time they stung worse than the first. How could they justify it? How could they spin it like it was nothing more than an accident, a mistake? "Do you really believe that?" Tasha asked, her voice quiet but filled with raw emotion. She wasn't looking at the attorney anymore. She was looking directly at Harris, her eyes filled with the weight of everything she had endured. "Do you honestly believe that was a mistake? That it was just a moment of fear?" Harris didn't meet her gaze. He looked away, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the ground. But Tasha saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the hint of guilt that he couldn't hide. For a brief moment she saw him for what he really was, a man who had gotten away with too much, for too long, a man who thought he was untouchable. Tasha's chest tightened, her voice shaking as she spoke again. "You don't get to act like this is nothing. You don't get to hurt people like me and walk away with no consequences. This isn't about fear. This is about power. The power you have over people like me. People who don't look like you. People who don't have your privilege. You use that power to hurt people, and you hide behind your badge, pretending like you're just doing your job." The defense attorney tried to cut in, but Tasha was on a roll now. She was no longer just a scared girl sitting in a courtroom. She was someone who had found her voice, and it was louder than ever. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Tasha said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm not afraid of any of you. I'm here to make sure that we, people like me, don't have to live in fear anymore. You don't get to decide who gets hurt and who doesn't. Not anymore." The room fell silent. Even the judge seemed to be caught off guard by her words. For a moment, there was only the sound of Tasha's breath, steady and strong. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of her fear start to lift. James looked at his daughter, pride swelling in his chest. She had become everything he had hoped she would, strong, courageous, unwavering. And for the first time in his life, he knew she was going to be okay. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with the tension of the moment. Tasha's voice had shaken the room to its core, but now, as the trial entered its final stages, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. James sat in the back, his mind spinning as he watched his daughter stand tall on that witness stand. Her words had changed everything. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a force, a symbol of resistance, and the power of truth. The defense had tried everything to discredit her, to twist the narrative in their favor, but nothing had worked. Tasha had told her story with such raw honesty, such undeniable courage, that the jury could no longer ignore the truth. The prosecutor was making his closing argument now, his voice steady and resolute, but all James could think about was the weight of the decision the jury was about to make. Could they really bring justice to his daughter, or would they side with the system, protecting the very officer who had wronged her? The prosecutor's voice cut through his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't just about one man's abuse of power. It's about a system that has allowed this kind of brutality to persist. We've seen the evidence. We've heard the testimony. We've heard from the victim herself. Officer Harris has done more than hurt a child. He has shaken the trust that people should have in those who are sworn to protect them. It is time for justice to be done. It is time for Officer Harris to pay for what he has done. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. The prosecutor's words were powerful, but there was a part of him, a deep and dangerous part, that was afraid. What if they didn't convict Harris? What if the jury couldn't see the truth for what it was? And then there was the other part of him, the part that wanted revenge, the part that wanted to make Harris and everyone like him feel the same fear, the same pain that Tasha had felt, the rage that had built up inside him since the day of the slap, since the moment he had seen his daughter, broken and scared, hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. James closed his eyes, trying to shake off the anger, trying to focus on the truth that Tasha deserved, the truth that they all deserved. But the thought of seeing Harris walk free made his blood boil. He wanted him to pay. He wanted the system to feel the weight of what it had done, to really feel it. But revenge, he knew, wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't take away Tasha's fear or the scars that she would carry for the rest of her life. James opened his eyes and looked at Tasha. She was watching him, her face filled with the same quiet strength that had carried them this far. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need Harris to suffer for her to heal. She needed justice, real justice. And that was something only the jury could give her now. The defense attorney stood up for his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm and controlled, "we have heard an emotional story from the prosecution. But let's not forget the facts. Officer Harris acted out of fear. He didn't act with malice or hatred. He was doing his job, trying to ensure the safety of his fellow officers. What happened on that day was tragic, yes, but it was not criminal. It was an unfortunate moment of heightened tension." James's fists clenched at his sides as the defense continued. The words were twisted, a desperate attempt to paint Harris as the victim, someone who had made a mistake but who shouldn't be held accountable for it. "Officer Harris is a good man," the defense attorney continued. "He has served this community with honor for years, and this is just a misunderstanding, a tragic misunderstanding." James could feel the anger surging again, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let this man control the narrative. Not now, not after everything they had been through. He glanced over at Tasha, who was sitting quietly beside him. Her face was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes, a quiet intensity that told him she was ready. She was ready to see this through. She was ready to get the justice she deserved. The defense attorney finished his argument, and the room grew even quieter as the jury deliberated. James didn't know what to feel. The waiting was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. The jury came back into the room an hour later. James's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't look at Tasha. He couldn't look at anyone. All he could do was hold his breath and wait. The foreman stood up and cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Harris, guilty of the charge of excessive use of force." James's breath caught in his throat. The words felt like a punch to the gut, but it was a punch of relief. They had done it. They had gotten justice for Tasha. They had done what so many others had failed to do. They had stood up against the system, and they had won. But even as the courtroom erupted in applause, James couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. He had gotten justice for Tasha, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The system was still broken. The fight wasn't over. He looked over at Tasha, and for the first time, he saw the weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't smile, not yet, but her eyes shone with something more powerful than any victory. She had faced down her fears, she had faced down the world, and she had come out the other side stronger. They had won, but the true victory was in the fight itself, and that, James knew, was something no one could take away from them. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of the verdict still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The guilt, the anger, the relief, everything that had been fought for over the past months had culminated in a moment of undeniable triumph. But now that it was over, James couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. The verdict had been delivered. Harris was guilty, but the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place, that was still broken, that was still in need of change. He walked out of the courthouse with Tasha at his side. The moment they stepped into the daylight, the weight of it all began to sink in. People had gathered outside, reporters, activists, bystanders, all eager to see the faces of the people who had brought the fight. The cameras flashed, blinding in their intensity, but James didn't flinch. He stood beside his daughter, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He couldn't bring himself to smile, not yet. The relief was there, sure, but there was also something else, a quiet, nagging uncertainty. Tasha had her head held high, her face still as determined as it had been during the trial. The media was talking to her now, asking questions, praising her strength. She answered each question with grace, her voice steady, but James could see the exhaustion beneath her calm exterior. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fight had taken everything from them, and while they had won today, the aftermath was something else entirely. The damage had been done, and no court ruling, no verdict, could erase it. James knew that now. Later that evening, as they sat in the living room, the house felt strangely quiet. The victory had come, but it didn't feel like the triumphant moment he had imagined. Tasha was sitting across from him, her legs tucked beneath her, scrolling through her phone. James watched her, his heart heavy. "You did it," he said softly. "You're a fighter. I'm proud of you." Tasha didn't look up from her screen, her thumb scrolling absent-mindedly. "I know," she said, her voice flat. "But I'm tired, Dad. I'm really tired." James's heart ached for her. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that everything would be okay, that they had won. But the truth was, everything wasn't okay. Harris had been convicted, yes, but the world still felt like it was spinning out of control. The system was still in place, the same corrupt system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. The fight didn't end just because the trial was over. Tasha looked up from her phone, meeting his gaze. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James shook his head. "No, baby, it's not over. Not yet. We've won a battle, but the war's still going. There are still people who need to be held accountable. There are still people who will try to bury the truth." She nodded, and for the first time since the trial, she let her guard down. The mask of strength she had worn throughout the proceedings slipped, and James saw the vulnerability in her eyes. He knew it wasn't just about the verdict. It was about everything they had lost, everything they had been forced to endure. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Dad," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I can keep fighting. I don't know if I have the strength." James's heart broke at her words, but he also knew the truth. Tasha had shown strength in ways he couldn't even begin to understand, but even the strongest people had limits, and this fight had pushed her to hers. He walked over and knelt in front of her, placing his hand gently on her knee. "You don't have to fight alone, Tasha," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been through hell together, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm with you no matter what. But if you need to step back, if you need to rest, I'll be here. We'll be here. You're not alone in this." Tasha's eyes filled with tears, and she let out a long breath as the weight of it all came crashing down. "I'm just so tired, Dad. Tired of fighting, tired of the hate, tired of everything." James pulled her into a tight hug, his heart breaking for her. He wanted to tell her that it would get better, that everything would be okay, but the truth was he didn't know. The world was still broken, and sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, it doesn't feel like enough. The next few days were filled with phone calls, interviews, and media coverage. People had already started calling Tasha a hero, a symbol of strength, but James knew that there was more to her than that. There was vulnerability, there was pain, and there was fear. Fear of what was to come, fear of what she had already been through. They both knew that the world was watching them. The victory had put them in the spotlight, but it also made them targets. The powerful people who had been behind the scenes, pulling strings, covering up the truth. None of them would go down easily. Harris was just one cog in a much larger machine, and the machine wouldn't stop just because one of its parts had been exposed. Lena had warned them about the backlash, and James could feel it building every day. The protests, the rallies, the public outcry, they were all just the beginning. But now, as the reality of their fight set in, James wasn't sure how much more they could take. Tasha had been strong, but even the strongest people could break. And James didn't know how much longer he could watch her carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. Weeks passed, and the aftershocks of the trial were still reverberating through their lives. Harris was behind bars, but that wasn't the end of the story. The city had been rocked, but it was only just beginning to wake up. The real question was, How many more battles would they have to fight before things truly started to change? James watched Tasha one night as she sat on the couch, staring at the news on TV. She had come so far, but he could see the weariness in her eyes. She was exhausted, and he didn't know how much longer she could keep going. The fight wasn't over, but neither was the struggle. And the truth, heart-wrenching and painful as it was that they would never be the same. They would never walk away from this unchanged. But somehow, that was okay, because they had made it this far. And in the end, that was all that mattered. It had been months since the trial, but it felt like years had passed. The world outside was changing, but the scars from the fight still lingered, both visible and invisible. James sat in the kitchen one morning, the sun peeking through the window as he sipped his coffee. Tasha was in the other room reading a book, her silence more telling than any word she could have spoken. The air between them was quieter now. The victory was behind them, but the road ahead felt uncertain. For a while, James had been able to fool himself into believing that justice would solve everything, that once Harris was convicted, everything would be okay. But now, he realized, the real work was just beginning. The truth had been exposed, yes, but the system hadn't changed. The fight was far from over. Tasha came into the kitchen, her eyes tired but resolute. She had learned how to mask her pain in public, but James knew her better than anyone. He could see the way her shoulders tensed when the news reports came on, the way her smile faltered whenever someone mentioned her name. She had won her battle, but now she was left to deal with the aftermath of being a symbol, a hero, a voice for a movement that was still growing. "How are you doing?" James asked, his voice soft. He didn't want to push, but he needed to know how she was feeling. Tasha paused, looking out the window for a long moment. The sun bathed her face, and for a brief second James saw the same quiet strength in her that he had seen during the trial. But there was something different about her now. She wasn't the girl who had been broken by the slap. She wasn't the girl who had stood alone in front of a courtroom. "I'm okay," Tasha said finally, but her voice was distant. She wasn't looking at him. "I mean, I'm getting there, but I can't pretend everything's fine, Dad. We won, but it doesn't feel like enough." James set his coffee down, pushing it aside. He walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly, concerned. Tasha turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. I don't know what comes next. We've exposed the truth, we've won, but the world didn't change overnight. The system didn't change. People are still out there, still scared, still hurt, and I'm still me. Nothing's really different. Nothing's really better. Her words struck him hard, harder than he'd expected. She was right, it wasn't over. Their fight had made a dent, yes, but the real battle, the one for true equality, for real justice, was just beginning. The problem wasn't just one officer or one instance of violence. It was the system that allowed it to continue, the people in power who profited from it, the silence of those who chose not to speak up. That system hadn't been dismantled. It hadn't changed. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all, the same way he had felt every time they had taken a step forward in this journey. He had always tried to protect Tasha from this reality, but now he understood. The fight wasn't just about them. It wasn't just about getting justice for one child. It was about fighting for every child, every person who had ever been silenced. And that meant taking on a system that had been broken for far too long. "I understand," James said finally. "I wish I could tell you that everything's going to be okay, that things will change right away, but I don't know that. What I do know is that the world is watching us now. They're listening, and we have a voice that they can't silence anymore. The road ahead isn't easy, but it's a road worth walking. You're not alone in this. I'll be with you, every step of the way." Tasha looked up at him, her eyes brimming with emotion, but the strength was still there. "You've always been there, Dad," she said softly. "I just don't know what happens next. I don't know how to keep fighting, how to make a difference. It's hard." James smiled gently, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone. You never have to do it alone." The weeks that followed were filled with interviews, public appearances, and endless media requests. Tasha's face was everywhere, on the front pages of newspapers, on social media, in the interviews where people praised her for her bravery. But despite the accolades, James could see the toll it was taking on her. The weight of being a symbol was heavier than any of them had anticipated. Tasha wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a movement. for a cause much bigger than she could have ever imagined. And yet, even with all the attention, all the support, there was a quiet loneliness that hung over her, a need to be more than just a figurehead, to find her own way in a world that still felt like it didn't care enough. She had always been strong, but this was different. This was a battle of endurance, a battle of hope, and through it all, she started to realize something. There was a future ahead of her, a future where she could help others, where she could use her voice, not just to be heard, but to make a real change. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about making the people who had hurt her suffer. It was about redemption, about creating a future where people like her, like her family, could walk through the world without fear. A future where her strength wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving. A future where change didn't just happen in the courtroom, but in the hearts of the people who stood with her. As James watched Tasha speak at a rally one evening, her words were filled with the hope that had been missing for so long. The crowd cheered, the air electric with anticipation, and for the first time, James felt it. The future was coming. They had started something. They had made the world listen, and now they would keep pushing forward, together. The years that followed the trial blurred into one another. The victory had been hard won, but the fight was far from over. Justice had been served for Tasha, for James, and for the countless others who had suffered under a broken system. But the real change, the kind that would last, was only beginning. Tasha had become more than just the girl who had stood up to Officer Harris. She had become a symbol of change, a force that could no longer be ignored. The trials, the tribulations, the countless sleepless nights, all had led to this. The world had started to listen. But what came next was what mattered most. She knew that. James knew that. As the months passed, Tasha found herself becoming increasingly involved in the movement that had sparked from her trial. She gave speeches at rallies, met with activists, and started working with organizations that were focused on reforming the justice system. But even with all the work she was doing, there was always the same question in the back of her mind. Was it enough? She had seen the way things had shifted after the trial. People were paying attention. More and more voices were joining the cause. But change was slow. It was painfully slow. And as much as she wanted to believe that everything was going to be okay, there was a part of her that still felt the weight of the system, the gravity of its deep-rooted flaws. She knew it wouldn't be fixed in a single moment. She knew it would take years, maybe decades. And still, she wondered if she had the power to truly make a difference. James had watched her closely in these months, his pride for her growing with every passing day. But he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion he felt in his own heart. The fight had been long, but the road ahead was even longer. There were days when Tasha seemed tired, as if the weight of it all was becoming too much. The pressure, the scrutiny, the demands of being the face of a movement that was still in its infancy. But James always reminded her that this wasn't just her fight. It was their fight, and it was a fight worth having. One evening, after another long day of meetings and press conferences, Tasha sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the piles of paperwork in front of her. James sat across from her, watching as she rubbed her temples, the lines of stress deepening on her face. "You know," James said softly, "I never thought we'd get this far. You've done more in the past year than most people do in a lifetime. You've opened eyes. You've made people see the truth." Tasha didn't look up. She didn't smile. Her eyes were distant, tired. "But it's not enough, Dad. I've done all this, but the world is still the same. People are still being hurt. I've seen the reports. I've seen the protests, the violence. It doesn't feel like anything's changed." James leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with a quiet conviction. "Tasha, I've seen how far we've come. You've ignited something in people. You've given them hope. And even if it doesn't feel like it now, this is only the beginning. You've planted a seed. Change doesn't happen overnight. It never has. But it starts with people like you. It starts with the truth, and that truth will carry on long after we're gone." She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," James replied, his voice unwavering. "The world needed to see that people like you, people like us, won't back down. That's what you've given them, hope, and that's something that can't be taken away." The words lingered in the room, heavy with meaning. Tasha felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, letting the weight of everything, all the pain, all the fear, finally release. She had fought for so long, and now, in this moment, she understood. She understood that her fight wasn't about her alone. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been ignored. The fight was about all of them, and it was a fight that would never truly end. The world had heard her. They had heard the truth. But there was still more to be done. She couldn't stop now. James stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Whatever comes next, Tasha, you don't have to carry it all alone. You've already done more than anyone could ask. Now we fight for the next step. Together. Tasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words sink in. The journey had been long, and it was far from over. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid to stand up. She wasn't afraid to speak the truth. And she wasn't afraid to keep fighting, for herself, for her family, and for everyone who needed her voice. As the weeks turned into months, Tasha and James continued their work, but now there was a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It wasn't just about exposing the corruption. It was about building something that would last, a movement that would outlive them both, that would continue to fight long after they were gone. And in that moment, Tasha knew one thing for certain. The fight had changed her. It had changed them both. But more than that, it had sparked something much larger. A movement that would carry the truth forward long after the courtrooms were empty and the cameras were gone. The truth had found its voice, and it would never be silenced again. This was their legacy,